Okay, so for the past week or so, I've been using the iPhone 12 mini, the smallest iPhone you can buy right now from Apple. This thing is even smaller than the iPhone SE 3. But despite being this small, it's just as powerful and almost just as capable as the normal iPhone 12. However, you've probably heard that to gain something, you have to lose something. So where on one hand, you are getting a small and compact and lightweight phone that's also very powerful. On the other hand, you do have to compromise on a few things, and one of them happens to be battery life. So I will talk about that for sure, but a little bit later in the video. Right now, I want to focus on the design, simply because I think it's the most noticeable thing about this phone as soon as you pick it up for the first time. More specifically, I'm talking about the size, because it still looks and feels like pretty much any other iPhone. It still has Gorilla Glass on both sides, in this case an aluminum frame, flat sides, which is the newer design for iPhones now, and the same lightning port, your speakers at the bottom, the Apple logo at the back, the humongous notch, mute switch, no headphone jack, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. It's an iPhone, just in a much smaller package this time. And honestly, as far as size goes, I'm a fan. I used to think that my iPhone XS was the ideal size for me, but after using this phone, I'm starting to think that this might be it. I just love how easily and how confidently I can hold and use this phone with just one hand. I feel like I will never drop this phone, especially if I use a case with even a little bit of grip on the sides, because although this matte finish frame looks nice, it is a bit slippery, so using a case will definitely help. But even if I drop this phone, I probably won't have to worry too much, because this thing is as durable as phones get. It's IP68 water and dust resistant, and according to Apple, the entire iPhone 12 lineup is using ceramic shield glass on the front, which is apparently 4 times more shatter resistant than just normal Gorilla Glass. So your screen is less likely to crack, which is always a good thing. Now, something you might want to know is that the color I have here is called black, but it's not actually black at all times. It changes from black to a very dark blue depending on the angle light hits this phone. Also, you might have noticed that this exact phone doesn't have the pill shape cutout on the side like some other iPhone 12 minis you might have seen on YouTube. And that's because I live in Canada, and although these phones have 5G, they don't support millimeter wave or high band 5G, which is what that cutout is for. Just little things you should probably know about this phone. Okay, let's talk about the screen. So this is probably the biggest upgrade this phone has gotten compared to its predecessor, the iPhone 11. It went from basically a 720p LCD screen to this beautiful 1080p OLED screen with 476 ppi. So not only it's a higher resolution, but it's also sharper, brighter, has better viewing angles, pure blacks, has significantly more contrast, and it's just as color accurate. But like I said before, in order to gain something, you have to lose something. So this 5.4-inch screen is noticeably smaller than the 6.1-inch screen on the iPhone 11. So if you like big screens, this ain't for you. And because this phone is using OLED technology, not LCD, it will most likely suffer from PWM flickering, which makes this phone basically unusable for people who can't use OLED screens. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I made an entire video about it. I'll link it below. You can watch it later. But this essentially means that the iPhone SE 3 is the only iPhone you can buy straight from Apple that has an LCD screen and also has one of the newer processors. And that's not good news for people who are sensitive to PWM flickering. Another thing I've noticed is that typing long messages on this phone can get a bit uncomfortable just because of how small the keyboard is. And I also find myself zooming in quite often while editing photos to clearly see some small details. However, reading text and stuff like that is not a problem, at least for me. It's just while editing photos, I felt the need to zoom in many times. Now, speaking of photo editing, a fairly intensive task, this phone actually handles it perfectly. It just doesn't seem to have any difficulty whatsoever, even for games like Call of Duty. And that's because of the processor inside this phone. This phone has an A14 Bionic inside with 4 gigs of RAM, and that combined with iOS makes this tiny little phone incredibly powerful. Everyday tasks like calling, texting, browsing, watching YouTube, using social media and stuff like that is a piece of cake for this phone. It just flies through all of that. And I used to think that the performance difference between this and something like my iPhone XS won't actually be noticeable, because I thought simple everyday tasks already don't push this phone to its limits. So I thought when I do that stuff on this phone, I won't see a difference. But it turns out I was wrong, because there is a difference. I can feel it. I haven't done any side-by-side speed tests or anything like that, but I know for sure that apps are opening faster on this phone. Things seem to load faster on this phone, and so far haven't had any app crash. So it actually feels like a newer, faster, and better phone, which is great. But what about the battery life? Well, let's talk about it. Okay, so this phone has a 2227 mAh battery. And yes, even for iPhones, That's a small battery. So right off the bat, things aren't looking too good. But when it comes to actually using this phone, I was able to consistently get around 5 to 5.5 hours of screen on time with like 5 to 15% battery remaining by the end of each day. So you can definitely kill this thing in a day, and I've done it. But that actually happened closer to 6 hours of screen on time. However, I think it's more important to consider how I got these numbers rather than what the numbers are. So for the most part, this was me just using social media, watching YouTube videos and stuff like that. This doesn't consist of any gaming, long phone calls, using Google Maps, using 5G, or even using the camera too much. All the things that tend to use a lot of battery. So if you're gonna do all that stuff, which I believe many people do, you can be sure to take out a big chunk from that 5 hours of screen on time and maybe bring it closer to something like 4 hours. And at that point, I would say the battery life is not good, because as long as you get around 5 hours, I would say the battery life is okay. And to be fair, for me, it's just fine. Like, this phone gets me through my day on a single charge, and I don't use it any differently than my normal daily driver, and it lasts me all day. But again, I don't drive, I don't use Google Maps, I don't make long phone calls and stuff like that. If I did, I would probably kill this thing before the end of each day. Plus, you also have to consider how this phone will age, because the battery health of this phone will decrease. That's inevitable. Right now, it's at 97%, which is really good. But think about it when it's at like 86% or 80%. So maybe 2-3 years later. The point is, the battery life will only get worse, and it's not great to begin with. Okay, I think I've said enough bad stuff about this phone. Let's talk about the cameras, the good stuff. That's right. Okay, so this phone has a wide angle and an ultra wide angle camera on the back, and a selfie camera on the front, all 12 megapixels. And honestly, photos and videos from all of these cameras are really nice. You can look for yourself. Pretty much all of these photos seem to be perfectly exposed. They're not too dark or too bright. They also look sharp, detailed, the focus is spot on, and colors also seem to be accurate most of the times. And because this phone has night mode, you can also expect to get pretty good photos in low light or at night. Now, the ultra wide angle camera is not as good as the main camera. It's not quite as sharp, but it's not bad by any means, and sometimes it's very useful. There are times when you just need that wide field of view, which this camera has, and it's something the main camera simply cannot do. The selfie camera also takes good photos, and I actually really like how wide it is. It's quite a bit wider than my iPhone XS's selfie camera, which is what I'm used to. And this one also has portrait mode, and like pretty much everything about these cameras, it's also pretty good. It works very well, but it's almost never perfect. I think recently Samsung has really stepped up their game in this department. So Apple, if somehow you end up watching this, just keep this in the back of your head for the iPhone 14. I'm sure you're already working on it and you've made it perfect, but you know, just in case you forgot, this is a friendly reminder. Okay, but seriously, should you buy this phone? Well, I'll start by saying this. I think it's a great phone. I really like it. But the thing is, for me, battery life is one of those things that ultimately determine whether or not I recommend a phone to an average user. That's just how it is, because I feel like if I go to buy a new phone, it's one of the first things I'm going to look at. So as much as I want to recommend this phone, I just don't think the battery life is good enough for me to do that. So if you think you're someone who will do the stuff I said I don't do a lot, like using Google Maps, using 5G and stuff like that, I would say maybe don't buy this phone and maybe consider checking out the iPhone 12, the normal iPhone 12. I haven't reviewed that phone just yet, but I'm pretty sure its battery life is a bit better than this. Otherwise, as far as I know, it's basically the same phone as this, just a little bit bigger. Now that being said, I still think there are people who will be just fine with this phone. People like me, teenagers. So if you just go to school and you just use social media here and there throughout the day, and if your usage is similar to mine, then I don't see a reason not to buy this phone, other than, I guess, wanting a bigger screen or just having some extra money for the normal iPhone 12. But if that is the case, why are you watching this video? Anyways, that's it for this video. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing and follow me on Twitter and Instagram, and I'll see you later. Started at 8:05, stopped at 9:33. Maybe I should just get a teleprompter.